Okay, guys, we are back with part 7 of House of Dark Shadows. I know I left you hanging yesterday, but I can't help it because that's kind of fun. So here we are, chapter 27. While Xander had tried to get help from the bonehead who'd had his soldiers attack him, the gladiator had closed the distance between them. When he looked away, the big man with made a sharp turn to cut him off. His feet skidded out from under him and he went down. The crowd let out a loud and sustained boo. Xander didn't wait to see what happened next. He sprinted the length of the arena, skirted bodies and body parts. Once again, he reached a large wooden door and pounded his fists on it. He wondered how many of the dead men on the ground around him had done the same thing. This wasn't going to work. He spied the gladiator jogging toward him. He couldn't play keep away forever. He'd seen the movie. They'd do something to make sure he was caught. Somehow, maybe with chained wild animals or legionnaires with razor-sharp blades, they'd shrink the area of combat until he had no choice but to face the gladiator. He ran to the nearest body, a boy not much older than Xander. The wounds made Xander fall to his knees and vomit. His panic had kept his stomach from betraying him until now. Until he'd decided to defend himself, his mind became more rational. And any rational person would have puked at the sight. The crowd cheered with delight. Xander wiped his mouth on his bare forearm. He spat and crawled over the dead boy. It seemed that death had not relieved him from his desire to possess a weapon. The boy's hand held firm to the handle of a mace. Xander pried his fingers open, feeling his stomach lurch again at the stiffness of the corpse's joints. He lifted the powerful weapon, which consisted of a stocky handle, a length of chain, and a heavy shot-put-like metal ball tricked out with spikes. He clambered up. His right arm was heavy and slow, weighed down by the chainmail and the mace. He used both hands to lift the weapon. He held it and swung it to his left. The ball moved sluggishly, as though Xander were trying to fight underwater. The gladiator approached. Xander pulled the handle to his right. The ball swung with it. He had to throw his hips back to avoid being hit by his own mace, but he thought he had figured something out. Once the ball was moving, it didn't want to stop. All Xander had to do was keep it going and steer it. He pumped his arms as though it were stirring a vat of molasses, and the ball swung out in front of him. It came back to his left side. When it swung out again, he pulled it towards his right. This kept the ball swinging in a semicircle around him. The problem was he couldn't get it higher than his stomach. Still, the gladiator seemed intimidated by this display. Perhaps he believed it was a cunning trick to lure an unsuspecting foe near. At which point, a fancy flick of the wrist would send the ball skyward and down on the opponent's head. If only, Xander thought. The chain, kept taut now, did not make the chinking, chain-like sound Xander had expected. It was the ball that emanated the sound of danger, with a whoosh, whoosh as it cut through the air. At his right ear, the chainmail's metal rings scraped together, reminding Xander of pebbles dropped onto a metal slide. These sounds and the grunting of the gladiator occupied Xander's auditory sense. The crowd had ceased to be. Xander was in a zone that maybe his brother would understand on a very minimal level because of his gaming acumen. Two combatants, life and death, nothing else mattered. Focus would make him better than he was. Still, he was outmatched. The gladiator possessed skill and experience and bloodlust and the strength to turn these things into a killing machine. The way he glared at Xander realized he was also focused on bringing down this last stubborn opponent. As the mace reached its leftward apex, Xander heaved up on its handle. The ball arced up. It passed in front of Xander, level with the gladiator's head. This potentially fatal move was impressive and completely unsustainable. As it swung out, it dropped heavily all the way to the ground. It took Xander with him, yanking him off his feet, like a novice water skier. He tumbled over it and wound up on his stomach, staring up at the gladiator jogging towards him. The man was laughing. Xander scrambled to his feet and ran. He had decided to take a stand, but now was no time to learn how to use a new weapon, especially one as exotic and as ancient as a mace. To his untrained and underdeveloped arms, it was nothing more than an anchor. If he had tried the last move while the gladiator was moving in for the kill, Xander would be dead now. He spotted another body at the far end of the arena and turned toward it. The chainmail on his arm was heavier and heavier. Wearing it was like carrying an anchor. As his feet dug into the sand, he unlatched the strap under his arm and let the chainmail fall away. As much protection as it provided, he needed agility more. Besides, it may have prevented a blow from the gladiator's sword from cleaving off of his arm. But without doubt, such a blow would shatter his bones. In agony, without the use of his arm, the gladiator's coup de grace would have come swiftly. Xander skidded next to the damaged body. A sword lay in the sand beside it. The handle was sticky with blood. All the better to keep my grip, Xander thought. He stood and faced the gladiator once more, who had closed the distance faster than Xander had expected. Xander swung the sword in front of him and screamed. What came out was guttural and animalistic and represented exactly what he felt inside. The gladiator sneered. It was the same twisting of the lips Xander had witnessed on the faces of countless bullies. It dawned on him that the gladiator was a bully to the extreme. The man lumbered forward. Despite his resolve, Xander took a step back, and then another. The top of a round boulder protruding from the sand caught his attention. Of course, it couldn't have been a boulder. Just beneath the sand of the Colosseum arena was a wood floor. Under it was the hypogeum, tunnels and rooms where the amphitheater managers kept slaves and animals before spitting them out for the entertainment of the crowd. The boulder was a shield. He sidestepped over it, stooped to pick it up, and the gladiator rushed in. Something prevented Xander from gripping the strap behind the shield. The gladiator loomed over him, raising his sword. The weapon disappeared into the brightness of the sun. With no time to wield it perfectly, Xander dropped his sword and clutched the perimeter of the shield. He lifted it towards him and ducked his head under it. The gladiator's sword slammed into the shield. It felt as though Xander were trying to hold back a battering ram. Metal clanged. The impact rattled his hands and vibrated up his arms to his shoulders. Instant pain, but nothing like it could have been, he thought. Nothing like the sting of death. With the shield pushed down upon him, he saw the reason he could not wield it properly. Another arm was already in the shield's straps. It had been severed mid-bicep at the edge of the shield. The dead fingers waggled at Xander as if bidding him farewell. That is so creepy. Chapter 28. Again, the sword came down on the shield, bending it in at the center. He hoped the gladiator would not notice his fingers and lop them off. The sword struck again, a central blow that drove Xander backward onto his butt. His legs were unprotected now, and one more blow would pitch him onto his back. The tip of the sword scraped the shield as the man lifted it out of the crease he had made. Xander released one hand from the shield. He put all his strength into swinging it around, aiming at the gladiator's knees. The gladiator was no fool. Obviously accustomed to last-ditch efforts at survival, he reeled back. The shield missed its mark. Xander lost his grip and it sailed away. Even before the gladiator had started moving away from it, Xander had grabbed his sword and slipped a foot under himself. And by the time the shield left his hand, he was already leaping forward. The tip of the blade trailed the shield's trajectory by no more than a second, and it was extended further than the shield's, thanks to Xander's forward momentum. It clipped the gladiator's left shin and then its right. Little bleeding mouths opened up under both knees. The man howled and staggered back. He did not fall. He bowed to examine his wounds. Probably, Xander thought, if the man lost a leg, he'd pick it up and beat his opponent with it. Xander saw his strike had caused little damage. He pushed himself up again and ran. There was no shame in it. He was there to survive, not honor Caesar or this barbarian game or even himself. Since he was learning about combat and weapons literally on the run, hightailing it was a strategy, not an act of cowardice. He pulled up to catch his breath. Before he could turn, he heard the gladiator's footsteps, like the crunching of cereal between molars. He spun, swinging his sword in time to deflect his opponent's blade. Sparks snapped between them. The man leaned in, howling in rage. Rancid breath filled Xander's nostrils. The man's eyes were black and hateful. Xander caught movement beneath him. The gladiator was reaching beneath their sword arms. His hand grabbed at Xander's torso, much the way David had done not so long ago, but so very far away. This time, however, Xander's skin was slick with sweat. The man's fingers could not get a grip. Xander pulled his sword back. It came off of the gladiator's weapon and dropped onto the top of his forearm. It sliced a deep groove in the man's flesh. Xander continued the movement of his hand until his sword had positioned over his head, ready to bring it down. Xander knew the gladiator's entire life had been about surviving in battle. He would not be defeated so easily. Xander caught a flash of the man's sword as it swung up. If nothing changed, it would catch Xander below the ribcage and angle diagonally through his chest to his heart. Abandoning the possibility of victory, as close as the lashing down of his hand, Xander pitched himself sideways. He somersaulted, was up and scurrying away again. That image of his heart impaled on the gladiator's blade made him sick and dizzy. It did not stoke the fire of determination. Rather, an overwhelming sense of defeat washed over him. It occurred to him that this was how battles were won and lost. They were not always the result of superior skill and stamina. Close calls, images of impending death, and the lack of opportunities were just as instrumental in putting combatants into the ground. Xander suspected that with experience, a fighter became accustomed to these little defeats, so he would reach the point of giving up much later than Xander would. Giving up? Nope, he was not there yet. He did, however, doubt his chances of getting out of there alive. After all, he was a 15-year-old boy, living a relatively cushy life by most standards. His opponent had lived a brutal life in a brutal world. He was a shark. Xander was nothing but a minnow. But even minnows wanted to live. The gladiator huffed toward him. If the nicks Xander had inflicted on the man's shins enraged him, the slice to his arm, and perhaps Xander's escape, had sent him into a stratosphere of maniacal hatred. Like the coolest line ever. Despite his wounds, the man moved faster. His sword sliced the air before him, this way and that. In 7th grade, Xander had fought a kid who was smaller than he was. Xander hadn't wanted a showdown, couldn't even remember what had ticked the kid off. He'd easily parried some blows. Finally, to end it, he gave the boy a hard knock on the side of the head. Instead of admitting defeat, the kid had come at him with a wild disregard for anything except pummeling Xander. Xander had discovered that pinwheeling arms were nearly impossible to stop. They just kept coming like a lumber mill's saw. And you were the tree. The gladiator was coming at him like that, with swords, though, instead of scrawny 7th grader fists. The blades moved so fast they left gleaming arcs in the air that appeared solid to Xander. He could hear them now, hissing through the air like the mace never had. Rage may have pushed the gladiator into this mulcher mentality, but he had not lost any dexterity in reaching it. The blades whirled in perfect opposition to each other, one coming up as the other came down. They crossed in front of the man and never so much as grazed each other. Xander backed away. He made feeble slashes at the approaching pinwheel of death. Xander wondered how, at a time like this, he could have even named an instrument of his own demise like that. Definitely too many movies. Too many movie posters and trailers with their catchphrases and taglines. "Stop," he yelled. "This isn't fair." He continued moving backward, keeping 10 feet between him and the whirling blades. He stepped on something, twisted his ankle, and almost fell. He steadied himself, lifted his leg higher, and stepped back. He had almost tripped over another body. He didn't want to see it. He'd join its former owner soon enough. The gladiator continued after him. That nasty sneer never left his face. He could have moved in for the kill at any time. Xander thought this drawn-out prelude to his dissection was orchestrated. The gladiator was as much a performer as a warrior. Xander hoped his body parts would not teleport back to the house. It was bad enough to die this way. Torturing his family with evidence of it was cosmically cruel. If his parts did make it home, would it be David who discovered them? Would they splash down at his feet in the little room? True, it would keep his brother from making Xander's mistake, but could you ever recover from seeing something like that? Xander was backing toward a wall. Soon, the only thing left for the gladiator to do was end this performance. Xander swung his sword again and again. If nothing else, he would go out fighting. When he could reverse no further, he screamed, another unintelligible representation of his anguish. Then the sound formed into words, defiant, angry last words. Come on, you fat pig! Just do it! The blades whirled. His own weapon clashed against them. Chang, chang. His wrist snapped one way and then the other as the blades battered his sword. And for a moment he wondered if he could pull his arm in so that the first hot cut would be the last he knew. However, he would watch his hand go first, and then his arm, fed slowly into the ancient Roman version of a blender. Something rumbled. The sounds of the crowd were returning to him, their feet stomping in anticipation. As his right hand swung towards the sword, his left hand counterbalanced the weight. Held out from his side and back just a little, his fingers pressed the hewn stone of the arena wall. The spinning blades ripped his sword from his grip. It flipped away. Something clamped around his left wrist. He was yanked into the wall. Then, through the threshold of one of the big wooden doors, he plunged into shadow. As the door rumbled closed, a latch snapped shut. From the other side, swords thunked against the wood. Hands grabbed his shoulders. Breath, not rancid but smelling of toothpaste, blew over him. Are you all right? Someone screamed. His legs felt weak. Emotion, like adrenaline, hit his heart, rushed into his face, and he said, Dad? It's okay, son. Hold on. Chapter 29, Saturday, 1:32 a.m. As Xander and his father crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut. Xander's face was pressed into his father's chest. Dad's arms around him had never felt so good. Xander opened one eye. He saw the bench and the shelf in the small room. David stood a few feet away. He was shaking and sniffing. His eyes were puffy and red, still leaking. He'd been crying, hard and long. Xander tried to smile at him. He squeezed even closer to his father, trying for just a moment to get lost in the man's warmth and smell, his very being. He hitched in a stuttering breath, and then he wept. It started gently and then grew into ragged sobs. Too many emotions to hold in. Relief swirled with the residue of intense fear. His soul felt abused and tired. A month before school had let out, Mitch Dawson had been goofing off in his new ride, a 74 Firebird Formula. He had been ripping donuts in the school parking lot. Mitch had lost control, nailed a car and a light pole. The Firebird had jumped the curb and rolled down the concrete embankment of a runoff canal. The whole school had run out to see. When Xander got there, Mitch was bawling like a baby. Everyone assumed he was grieving for his totaled car, but later he confessed to Xander that as the car was rolling, he'd been completely and utterly convinced he was going to die. Through an embarrassed smile, he said, I stared death in the face and got another chance. Xander had nodded, but had not truly understood. Now he did. Dad let him cry it out. He stroked Xander's hair and whispered over and over, You're here now. When the worst of it was over, he felt David hug him from behind. The boys slid around to include their father in the embrace. They stayed like that for a long while. When Xander raised his head, David released them, and Xander took a step back. He wiped at his cheeks and ran the underside of his nose over his forearm. He sniffed back what hadn't already come out, and he said, I'm sorry. Dad squeezed his shoulder. I'm just so glad you're here. Xander glanced at David and then back to Dad. But how? Your brother came and got me. He offered David a tight, I'm proud of you smile. Xander turned to David. He couldn't help it, and he had to hug him. David returned the squeeze, but said, Are we a bunch of girls or what? Shut up. When Xander released him, David didn't let go. Man, I thought you were gone forever. So did I. I couldn't find the... Dad, how did you follow me? Then he noticed the animal pelt tied around his father's waist over his pajama bottoms. The sword Day had been holding was in the scabbard slung around Dad's neck, hanging under his arm. Xander had a faint memory of feeling it as he embraced his father, but he had been too lost in his emotions to care what it was. I couldn't get the door open, David exclaimed. It locked me out. Dad put those things on and opened it. Xander said, How did you know to do that? David told me how the door opened after you put the chainmail on and helmet. He shrugged. Not difficult to figure out. But why didn't you end up where I did, in the middle of the arena? Dad's eyebrows went up. You can add that to my long list of questions, Xander. Where did you appear? In the bleachers, on the other side of where I got you. I went through, and suddenly I was standing in the middle of a crowd that was chanting for someone's death. I almost croaked myself when I saw it was you. Xander squinted at him. They were chanting, sign something. Do you know what it was? Sine misone. It means to the death. Romans used to say it to encourage the winning gladiators to take down their opponents. Dad, we were in the Colosseum. I recognized it. Wait, like in Rome? David asked, catching the excitement. But it was new, Xander told his father, like it was 20 centuries ago. History is my subject, son. Good thing I studied the Colosseum. I knew there were tunnels under the arena, and when I saw where you were heading, I used them to reach the door closest to you. Just in time, Xander said, and felt his eyes tear up again. Just in time, David said. What happened? Xander opened his mouth to answer, but simply couldn't. He didn't know where to start, how much to say. Was that real? He asked his father. It felt real to me, and David poked Xander's arm. Xander flinched away. Ah! A long swath of skin had been flayed from his bicep. It was glistening red. Blood had trickled down to his elbow. Ow! David said for him. Dad said, talk about a close call. You almost lost your arm. Arms, Xander corrected, and legs and head. Wait, what? David squealed. How? What happened? I'll tell you later, okay? David had moved beyond the terrible panic he must have felt at Xander's disappearance. Now he was fired up. But out of respect for his brother's condition, he nodded. He could wait. Barely. Dad untied the pelt and hung it from his hook. He slipped the sword and scabbard off of his shoulder, and then hung it on the next hook. These things, he said, I'm not sure how, but I think they help us get back. He studied them, hanging on the hooks, swinging gently back and forth. When I got to your side of the Colosseum, they got, I don't know, heavier? I realized they hadn't gained pounds, but they were pulling away from me. They were like trying to go somewhere. And when I grabbed you, I kind of went with them. I let them tug me where they wanted to go. Tug? David said. That pelt and sword were tugging you? Dad nodded. That's what it was, a tug. And when I gave into it, we fell back and landed here. So the items are what get you there and bring you back? Xander asked. I don't know if they bring you back or simply show you the way. Maybe we were close to the portal anyway, and they led us to it. He eyed Xander funny. David said you had chainmail and a helmet, Xander said. I left them back in the arena. Now that you say it, the chainmail did get heavy, and that's why I dropped it. Maybe it was tugging me towards the portal. His face paled. If I needed them to get back and I lost them, I could have been stuck there. His eyes welled with tears. If you hadn't come for me, Dad gripped his shoulder. It's okay. We're here now. That's all that matters. Except for not helping me get back, Xander said. Is it bad I lost them? Nothing bad will happen because I didn't bring them back, will it? Dad shook his head. No more questions, Xander. And he lifted his foot onto the bench, leaned an arm over his knee. I've got questions for you two, though. Here it comes, Xander thought. The lecture, the scolding. He and David exchanged a look. Their dad simply said, chocolate or vanilla. If he had suddenly slapped David, he could not have elicited a more stunned expression on the boy's face. Xander stumbled over the words, but what, don't you want to talk to us about all of this? And he swept his hands in a wide arc, trying to encompass the room. This room, all the rooms, the hidden stairway, the corridor. Dad scrunched his brow. We'll get into that, but let's go have some sleep first. And then, of course, ice cream. Well, since you put it that way, Xander said, chocolate, definitely. Chapter 30. Saturday, 10:13 a.m. It was only a dream, Xander thought. He blinked against the sun coming through the bedroom windows. Then he rolled over. The wound on his arm flared with white-hot pain. Ah! David stirred under his covers. He turned to face Xander. Are you hurt? No, I always wake up screaming, he said. He turned the clock radio towards him. 10:13. Wow. Dad must have asked Mom to let them sleep in. She usually is all over them if they weren't up before the sun gets hot. He said, I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing, fighting a gladiator in the Roman Colosseum. David shook his head. It wasn't a dream. I was there when you went, and Dad brought you back. Xander closed his eyes. Thinking about it made his stomach sour. All those bodies, his own close shave with death, even the simple fact that life's rules, especially the ones dealing with time and space, little things like these, were not carved in stone as he had been taught. All of it made him feel disoriented, like a kite broken from its string, whipping around in the wind. He'd just woken up and was getting a headache. Xander, what happened over there? You said Dad got there just in time. He didn't open his eyes. Are you going to tell me? David, it wasn't good. Trust me, you don't want to know. I want to try it. Xander's eyes flipped open. It? Going someplace. Through the door. No, you don't want to try it. Don't even say that. Dad did it and came right back. He wasn't in any danger. David, I almost died. But you didn't. His eyes sparkled with excitement. I didn't know you were so stupid. David's smile faltered. Xander reminded himself that Day had saved his life last night. If he hadn't fetched their father, Xander would have been slaughtered by that barbarian. In fact, he would have been in his grave for about 2,000 years by now. That was something to think about. Xander blinked slowly. Sorry, I'm just saying I don't know why you'd even want to think this way when you saw what happened to me. I didn't see. That's just it. Well, I'm telling you, okay? I almost died, and it was the most horrible experience of my life. David considered this, and after a time he said, I'm not talking about going where you went, just somewhere. Xander threw his legs out from under the covers and sat up. He thought of David and the situation he'd been in. Under the shield as the sword came down, he wouldn't have had the physical strength to survive. Nothing against him, just his age. And all those bodies, Xander wasn't sure how he was going to handle it over time. He got up and sat on David's bed. I know it sounds exciting. I mean, I would think that too, but it's just not worth it. David looked like he had been told Christmas had been called off. And he said, you and Dad got to do it. If we'd been in a car accident, would you want to do that too? That's different. It's not different, David. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It's just as scary and potentially deadly. When Dad brought me back, the first thing I thought was of a friend who'd been in a car accident. I'm telling you, that's what it was like. David's face reflected his disappointment. Xander could tell he wasn't totally convinced. Xander said, promise me you won't sneak off to do it. David said nothing. Promise me. David's lips grew tight. The bottom one rolled out a little. His stubborn face. If you don't promise, I'm going to follow you every second of every day, even to the bathroom. I'll be like a bad smell you can't wash away. Slowly, a smile found David's face, and he said, I promise. Okay. Xander pushed him playfully on the chest. He stood. He snatched his jeans off a post at the foot of the bed and pulled them on. He'd showered the night before, which was really early this morning. He could not believe how much grime and dirt and blood the water had sluiced off of him and toward the drain. His father had stayed with him, leaning against the sink, talking quietly. Xander knew Dad was worried about him. He had seen some of what Xander had gone through. He had also commented that he had hoped the jaunt itself to another time and place did not have lasting consequences on their physical bodies or mental state. Xander should have reminded David of that, but he had gotten him to promise that, and that was all that mattered right then. Dad had said that they would decide what to do about the rooms upstairs another time. For now, they were off limits. He had also asked the boys not to tell Mom or Toria. He was afraid they would panic and want to leave without carefully considering the situation. And since the corridor was behind a secret wall, there was no need to stir up trouble. Let sleeping dogs lie, Dad had said. It bothered Xander that in such a short time since their move, the number of secrets in their family had skyrocketed. What are you going to tell Mom? David asked, seeming to know Xander's thoughts. This was one of the topics he and Dad had discussed while he let the hot shower strip centuries-old dirt off of his body. When he'd come to bed after that, David was already asleep. He looked at the gauze and tape that Dad had applied. Just an accident while investigating the house. David sat up in bed. You're going to flat out lie? Xander pulled on a t-shirt. His movements made his arms throb. It's not really lying. We were investigating the house, and it was an accident. He registered David's expression inside. I know. It's not a lie, but it's darn close. Dad said sometimes lies told to keep people safe are okay. Do you think Dad's lied to us? Xander pulled a pair of socks from his drawer and picked up his sneakers. He'd put them on outside on the front porch steps. He wanted to spend more time outside today. He shook his head. I think Dad's as straight as they come. David smiled. As he left the room, Xander thought, what's one more lie? Okay, guys, I'm stopping there for today.